Well, welcome to the first of a series of Board of Health public forums. This one is Wednesday, the 29th of March at 4 p.m. This is going to be hybrid participation in person or via Zoom. There will be other Board of Health members present. Going to change the introductory paragraph a little bit. So I just found out yesterday that the capacity to have hybrid meetings, which are government meetings, has now been extended until March 31st of 2025, according to the Massachusetts Association of Health Boards. So we will be doing hybrid meeting, which is fine as long as members of the public can easily access the proceedings in real time and participate remotely. This meeting will be conducted both in person and via remote participation. Members of the public who wish to watch the meeting may do so in the following manner. Tune into PAC TV, government cable access channels, Comcast channel 15, or Verizon channel 47, and watch the meeting as it is aired live, or watch the meeting live on PAC TV website. You may also watch when the show is replayed on pactv.org's website. Members of the public who wish to participate in the meeting may do so in the following manner. In person at the Great Hall located at the second floor of Plymouth Town Hall, 26 Court Street, Plymouth, Massachusetts. You may also do remotely. There's a link for that purpose on the agenda. You may also send any comment or question that pertains to a current agenda item or presentation to publichealth@plymouth-ma.gov. They'll be read on the air and answered by the panel or Board of Health members as practical. If time doesn't permit answers during the meeting, responses will be sent by email as soon as possible. So just a couple of other clarifications. This is a public forum. It's informational only. So there will be no motions made by the Board of Health. There'll be no votes taken by the Board of Health. We are simply spreading information from other sources. And there will be time towards the end for some discussion and question and answers. So we'll make sure that we reserve time for that. You're going to be seeing a series of videos. The videos were made available to us by a group that sponsors a similar sort of forum for the Indian Point nuclear reactor in New York. So we'll be going through those one at a time and displaying those as best as we can so everyone can see them. Just going to take a moment to look through the list of people that have joined us as attendees, which is now 16. I don't see some of the people I had expected. But if anybody feels that they should be allowed to talk, if you would just use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, so we know you wish to talk. So the first thing we're going to do is going to be actually begin some of the recorded videos. They each take approximately 11 to 19 minutes in length. And there's going to be, I guess, 4 of them, at least initially. And there's also going to be one statement that's going to be more brief, given by Dr. Britta Lundberg, who is the chair of the Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. That'll be the third item. So, Margaret, if you can activate and show the video for Diane Turco, I'll do the introduction of her.
That video, because I only have the ones from Grassroots. Is it on that?
It's
website?
from Grassroots. It's from the first Grassroots forum, not the second.
The February 16th.
That's the second one. There's another one for January 26th,
All right.
I think.
Let me bring that up. I'm going to share the screen, and then you can direct me from there. How's that?
Okay.
All right. Can you see the screen, Barry? Oh, it should be.
Yes, I can.
Okay. So.
So if you just scroll down towards the bottom, you see that part 4, Diane Turco.
Yep, you'd like that one.
And if you just put that up and put it to full screen, please.
Sure thing. There's just a little bit of lag time.
like to introduce our final speaker, Diane Turco, who is the director of Cape Downwinders, a Cape Cod, Massachusetts grassroots group working for decades investigating, educating, and agitating for public health and safety on issues involving the Pilgrim nuclear reactor in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Its current campaigns include preventing Pilgrim owner Holtec from dumping over 1 million gallons of radioactive water into Cape Cod Bay, and advocating for safer storage and security at the independent spent fuel storage installation at the reactor site in Plymouth. Thank you very much for joining us today, Diane.
Thank you for having me. And this is just exciting, and I'm just so honored to be with Dr. Caldecott. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. I heard her speak in the 1980s, and now I'm here still with you. So I'm honored, Dr. Caldecott. I'm director of the Cape Downwinders. I've been working on this issue for over 30 years. I'm also a member of the Save Our Bay MA Coalition, and this is a coalition of great folks from Pilgrim Watch to Mass Seafood Collaborative to the Herring Pond Wampanoag. We have a great coalition of folks working to stop Holtec's plan to dump over 1.1 million gallons of radioactive water into our beautiful Cape Cod Bay. And what we have here is this is a beautiful picture of Cape. In our community is a greedy corporation, Holtec, trying to protect its bottom line. In our community, trying to protect the health of our families, the livelihood of our coastal communities and commons, and the habitat of marine life. It's just stunning if you've ever been to Cape Cod. It's a stunning area, and we're trying to protect it. Okay, so what's happening today? Well, in 2019, Holtec purchased Pilgrim from Entergy Corporation to decommission this reactor. And we thought Entergy was bad, but Holtec is a whole new game here. They are at the point where they need to get rid of this water in order to take down the reactor building. And what their plans are is to dump it into our bay. We have been doing educational programs. We have this, you know what, I can't see some of my slide because of the screen on the side there, but we have, we've been doing educational programs. Dr. Irina Rapana from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute completed a study with looking at the currents. And we know if they dump that radioactive water, it's going to go into Cape Cod Bay. And as Dr. Helen Caldecott said, that contains tritium, all those radionuclides, and they're going to get into the sediments and they're going to swirl around in the bay. And I don't know if you've had Duxbury oysters or Wellfleet oysters, but that's the home of a lot of marine life. She also found out that the water could go up and then hug the outside of the Cape. Those are beaches, national seashore, where people come with their children and their babies and swim and enjoy this area. But if Holtec gets their way, they're going to be discharging, and that's where that water is going. We're also lucky in our community to have an excellent reporter, Christine Legier. She writes for the Provincetown Independent. And you can see the headlines that people on the Cape are reading. It's just so powerful. The new study concludes Pilgrim plumes would hit out of Cape. The dangers of the radionuclides in the water. Her work has been educating our community, and it's so important to have the press with us. But what also we do too is political work. On the Cape, every single town had a non-binding public advisory question on their ballot last spring actually. And it was a question that said, Holtec should not be dumping into our bay, and every town voted. This is thousands of people voting. Overwhelmingly, no dumping in our bay. But in Massachusetts, we also have Senator Markey, Senator Warren, Representative Keating, our county commissioners, our Assembly of Delegates. We have also Duxbury, the Board of Health in Plymouth and Scituate have also been on this to say no dumping. So we have everyone and their mother saying no dumping in the bay, and yet Holtec continues to pursue dumping. When they came to our community, they promised openness and transparency. They said they would listen to stakeholders, and they are very concerned about environmental justice. But we're finding out that these claims are just red herring, because dumping in our bay is illegal. And actually, we have this poster because Holtec came to one of our nuclear decommissioning meetings, the panels like you have in New York, and they said that they were going to show us their water samples. Well, they brought water samples from 2015. They are not to be trusted. Okay, so why is this illegal? There's the Clean Water Act, the federal law that the EPA is responsible for, that says the waters of there can be no chemical pollutants discharged in the waters of the United States. And currently there is the NEPDES permit, and I don't know if you have that at your site too in New York, but the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And the EPA has told Holtec they cannot dump, it's not permitted under this permit. We also have the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office settlement agreement. When Holtec, when our Attorney General filed a petition when Holtec was purchasing Pilgrim from Entergy, and they came to an agreement, and that Holtec would have to comply with all applicable environmental and health-based standards of the Commonwealth. So this is covering us in our state beyond any federal agreement. We also had the Massachusetts Protected Ocean Sanctuaries Act that said you cannot discharge into our protected waters, and that includes radionuclides. So at our state level, we are protected from discharge of radionuclides into the bay. So Massachusetts, our Attorney General now, Governor Maura Healey, has said that excuse me, that they're prepared to take action to prevent any violation of Holtec's state and federal discharge permit and other violations. And the big issue here is Holtec doesn't have to dump it into the bay. That's an illegal plan. There are legal plans, and while nothing is perfect, there are legal methods that they could use. So this is a big issue for us because Holtec still maintains they can dump into our bay.
There will not be 1 million gallons of radioactive water dropped in Cape Cod. I think we can say with the commitment that one of the alternatives in vaporization, if we want that, instead of dumping it there, it's okay. So as far as I'm concerned, we're not dumping any water, radioactive water in Cape Cod. And I want to thank Mr. Singh for his commitment to doing that.
So I think, well, I'm going to give you, Mr. Singh, I'll give you one final concluding statement if you'd like to make it.
Thank you, Senator. I truly appreciate it. Look, I'm not used to verbal acrobatics.
Excuse me?
I said I'm not used to verbal acrobatics. I said we will not dump contaminated water anywhere. I also said that the water is not contaminated by its definition, but we will not discharge any water in the Cape Cod Bay unless we have major stakeholder concurrence.
It's such doublespeak and it's such nonsense. So here's just a quick brief of what Holtec and the Environmental Protection Agency have been battling all year. First of all, January, a year ago, Senator Markey, Senator Warren, and Representative Keating said they are opposed to any discharge. So in February 17th, the EPA said it's explicitly prohibited. Holtec said, well, no, it's within our permit as we see it. Holtec said, no, it's not. July 7th, the EPA said again, you must comply with the permit. It is not allowed. And Holtec said, we believe it is. November 17th, Holtec said, we expect to be using treated water. On November 28th, David Noyes, who is the Holtec compliance officer, which is kind of an oxymoron, said that they believe that there's no problem with the permit. And when he was asked if they would discharge. In December, the EPA said you will receive fines and jail time if you discharge Holtec. And Holtec, in a letter back, all water volumes will be independently processed and then combined for discharge. Holtec is just horrible They play games. I'm sorry that these videos aren't, when we practice this, they were working. I don't know why they're not, but Jim and Mary Lambert have been in front of this for decades too, and they have been doing awesome work, and I don't know if this is going to go, but this is.
My question that I put to Dr. Singh, and I'm sure you've seen the question, I hope you get a clear answer, you may have gotten it, was, will Holtec agree that it will not release any of Pilgrim's waste into Cape Cod, Plymouth, Duxbury, or Kingston Bay, because those are clearly prohibited by the regulations with which, in settlement agreement, you agreed to comply.
So the direct answer to your question is no, we will not say that we will not discharge water to Plymouth Bay. All right, that is still an option that remains on the table.
So the hubris of Holtec has revealed that their business plan, their ecocide, exposes their complete disregard for our community's health, the economic viability, marine environment, and public safety. So together we have to halt Holtec. What we've learned here, I'm almost at the end, to look at your state laws and identify what laws protect bodies of water, and look at the specific laws to address the Hudson River or New York waterways. We tried that in the state of Massachusetts, and there was a bill at the State House, but it didn't go anywhere. We think Holtec has kind of a hold on the State House. Check what state authority or bargaining power you have with your settlement enforcement. Our AGO agreement gives Massachusetts enforcement of state health and environmental laws above the EPA. Check your permitting process, and particularly your NIPD's permit and state permits, because we're finding that our state folks are kind of on the fence about what these permits, how these permits will be enforced, and organized at the state, local, and national level. And I'm so excited that we're all working together on this, because Holtec is gaming the system. And so we need to stay together, because as Dr. Caldecott says, if you love this planet, we'll do it. Thank you.
Barry, you're muted.
Okay, thanks for showing the video. I just want to clarify a couple of things for the audience. You probably heard a lot of references to New York. These videos were all prepared for the group that is battling Holtec, who is in the process of also dismantling the Indian Point reactor on the shores of Hudson River. Their plans involve dumping the radioactive water into the Hudson River, and that's caused quite a huge stir and a controversy there. So we have a lot of things going on in common with the folks on the Hudson River up at Indian Point. And they have agreed to work with us also to do whatever is possible to try to dissuade Holtec from following through with what they're apparently planning to do. There's a couple of things that came up during that discussion, especially with the president of Holtec. The word contaminant came up. And according to the NRC, apparently radioactive materials are not considered a contaminant. According to every other definition you could find if you search for contaminant online, radioactive materials are in fact contaminants. Some of them do occur naturally, but certainly not to the extent that you find them from a nuclear reactor. So that'll give you a little bit of a background. I'm going to actually switch now and see if I can screen share a bit of history before we go on to the next video. So I'm going to see if I can get to Can everyone see that? Someone could unmute and tell me that's visible.
Yes, you're all set.
Barry,
Yes.
would you be able to increase the size so that the words are more legible?
If I do that, I think I'm going to lose the other half of the screen. But let's see if there's any way I can do it. If anyone can help me with this, I'm going to read it anyway, so I'll read through it as quickly as I can. So this is just a timeline, just so everyone who's listening in knows what's happened since the beginning. So in 1967, the Boston Edison Company announced it was going to build a nuclear power plant in Plymouth. The construction began about a year later in 1968. It took $231 million and more than 3 years to finish the plant. Plant began to generate power for electrical grid in December 72. In 1982, Federal Regulatory Commission fined Boston Edison $550,000 for safety and reporting violations. In 1983 and again in 1986, the plant shut down for mechanical problems. The NRC at that point dubbed Pilgrim one of the worst run plants in the country. In 1997, Massachusetts deregulated the energy system. Boston Edison put Pilgrim up for sale, and a Louisiana-based company known as Entergy purchased it for $80 million in 1999. There was a growing anti-nuclear movement in Massachusetts, which coincided with a debate over whether NRC should extend the plant's operating license. Entergy asked for a 20-year extension in 2006. For 6 years, local residents fought the relicensing. In 2012, with litigation still pending, NRC voted 3-1 to extend the license. Those opposing the relicensing were outraged. NRC downgraded Pilgrim's safety status again in 2014, dimming it one of the 9 worst reactors in the country. Following year, NRC downgraded the plant again, making it one of the 3 worst performing reactors and 1 step away from mandatory shutdown. Meanwhile, the price of natural gas was decreasing, making the plant less profitable. In 2015, Entergy announced they're going to close it by June 1 of 2019. In the summer of 2018, Entergy announced a plan to sell Pilgrim to Holtec International for decommissioning. Holtec already manufactures the dry cast that you can see on the right that are used at Pilgrim and also at all the other nuclear reactors that they are in the process of decommissioning. And they are used to store spent nuclear fuel rods. Later in 2018, 2 companies filed a joint license transfer application with the NRC, and the final shutdown occurred at 5:28 p.m. on Friday, May 31st, 2019. There are currently 4,114 fuel assemblies at Pilgrim. They will remain reactive for thousands of years, and there is no place to transport them to a legal disposal facility. So they're going to stay in Plymouth indefinitely. They're currently stored in about 62 of these dry casks. And we don't know when they're going to be ever removed. They may not ever be removed. So the dry casks look like that. They're huge structures. They have, I believe, 2 metal encasements, and then it's surrounded with rather thick concrete. And if I scroll down a little bit, you see another picture of them from another angle. And down below that, is a picture of the spent fuel pool, which is where, when they refuel the reactor, the fuel rods are stored or were stored until they were transferred to the dry casks. So that went on for quite some time, but now everything, all the fuel rods that were stored in the spent fuel pool have been moved to the dry casks. The dry casks have been moved away from the shorefront to put them further back from the ocean, where they're going to remain forever. So they still have all the reactive elements, the radioactive elements that were present in the initial fuel rods, some of which have very long half-lives. On the right-hand side, you'll see the examples of the program stations, or any nuclear reactor station for that matter, and the way in which you can get exposure to the radioactive materials. You notice at the very top, there's a little screen that looks like a plume of gaseous material coming out of the stack. That seems to routinely happen when fuel rods are being replaced. It has happened in the past. In order to do that, they have to actually depressurize the reactor vessel. And when they do that, there is a release of water vapor and gaseous effluents into the air. Unfortunately, depending upon the air circulation, if it rains or there's a fog, you can then get what's known as rainout, and whatever's present in that radioactive gas that was let loose from the nuclear fuel reactor ends up coming back down onto the ground. So it gets into the groundwater. It can also get into the bay. When it gets into the bay, it can be actually consumed first by phytoplankton, where it accumulates and becomes bound to organic matter. And then other marine animals, such as fish and shellfish, consume the phytoplankton. And again, now it's organically bound. And it goes into those animals and it accumulates in them as well. Unfortunately, then you can possibly get human consumption coming by and actually consuming the fish or the shellfish, or even the meat from the animals that may have been grazing on the outside area where there might be deposition of some of the radioactive materials. You can also get direct radiation from some of the radioisotopes, principally not tritium. Most of the others that have gamma radiation would be the ones you'd worry about. But tritium can be absorbed, since it's actually water, it's radioactive water, can be absorbed through the skin directly into the body. You can also, of course, inhale it. And so you could inhale, as you can see over here, radioactive tritium or anything else which is in the air around there. And this has been known to cause a considerable amount of increased levels of cancer in areas that surround nuclear power plants. And the number, I'll give you some numbers a little bit later on for that, but there are some numbers that have been put together by a number of different news organizations and by hospitals. And some of them are rather disturbing. So Dana-Farber did a study on that. And another study showed that if you look around the Pilgrim reaction site, that there was a 4-fold excess of leukemia cases above what you would otherwise expect in the neighborhood of the nuclear power plant at Pilgrim. There's also an excess of cancers being diagnosed in the area of Plymouth County. I haven't looked really at the town of Plymouth that much, which is in excess over the same incidence of cancer that you find both in the Commonwealth and in the United States in general. So just to give you an idea of what those numbers look like, according to Dana-Farber, the incidence rate in Plymouth County for cancers is 470.1 per 100,000 people. In the Commonwealth, it's 443.5. In the United States, it's 422. So clearly, Plymouth County is up there. If you start looking at other counties in Massachusetts, you find numbers that are even worse than that. Out in Dukes County and Martha's Vineyard, they're the worst, followed by Nantucket, followed by Plymouth County, which we just saw, followed by the almost identical numbers in Barnstable County. So this will come back up when we start talking about what can happen if people actually intake some of these radioactive materials, which are known to actually have radioactive emissions that can damage DNA, especially if they're ingested, inhaled, or absorbed. So I'm going to stop the screen share there. And I'm going to ask, well, I'm trying to make sure that some of these other people haven't come on with us. Doesn't look like it. So I'd first ask if there are any members of the Board of Health that have any specific questions for Diane. If she's present, I thought she might be zooming in. I haven't noticed her name. But Diane, if you're present, if you can make your presence known. It's Diane Turco. I'm not sure if she was able to join us or not. So Margaret, if you get any message or indication that Diane Turco was among the attendees, we need to admit her.
See anything, Barry?
I don't see her name. Okay. In the absence of that, the next video was actually prepared again for the New York group, but it has a lot of information specifically now about tritium. And this was done by Arnie Gunderson. He's a chief engineer at the Fairwinds Associates. He's a nuclear engineer and a former nuclear industry executive. More than 51 years of nuclear industry experience in engineering operations and safety analysis. He and his wife, Maggie, who were Fairwind's founders, became nuclear whistleblowers in 1990. They've published dozens of expert reports for legal cases and non-government and nonprofit organizations worldwide. He's going to show you a presentation that will focus on the ability of radioactive treatment systems for fuel poor water, excuse me, to remove radioactive isotopes, and why it's impossible to remove tritium from that same water by filtration. So let's try it again. Margaret, if you would, if you go back to the February 16th list of videos, you should find Arnie Gunderson's video there. Oh, there's Arnie. Arnie and Maggie are being promoted to panelists, so.
Yeah, I'm not, I don't want to be on there, but we had a glitch.
Okay. So we're about to show you a video that will be the subject of maybe some discussion and questions. As soon as Margaret can bring it up for us.
Sure, what video you'd like me to bring up?
Well, if you show me the list, you'll see the one for Arnie Gunderson.
It's also on Grassroots.
It's still on Grassroots, but it's for the February 16th Grassroots list.
One that's part 3.
Yes, I believe it is. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Arnie, for joining us. Arnie Gunderson is the chief engineer at Fairwinds Associates, is a nuclear engineer and a former nuclear industry executive with more than 51 years of nuclear industry experience in engineering, operations, and safety analysis. Mr. Gunderson and his wife Maggie, are the founder of Fairwinds, became nuclear whistleblowers in 1990. Fairwinds has written dozens of expert reports for legal cases and non-government and nonprofit organizations worldwide. Mr. Gunderson is also a co-author of 3 major international peer-reviewed scientific papers documenting the contamination of environments by migrating radioactive microparticles of dust and dirt. Thank you, Mr. Gunderson, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and a shout out to the organizers and to Dr. Nolan, who I was really excited to hear, and hopefully she'll come back, and to Mary Olson too. I'm pleased to be on the panel. So my discussion, I will focus on tritium, how it's produced, and what can be done about it. I need to start, before I talk about tritium, I need to start about nuclear fission. Nuclear fission is a uranium atom is a huge atom. It has 235 protons and neutrons in it. And it's when it splits, not in half, but when it splits apart, it gives an enormous amount of energy. And we all know that. That's what makes bombs. That's what makes nuclear reactors. The heat of splitting a uranium atom in half or in parts is what is the huge advantage to nuclear fission. But the disadvantage is that this stuff left behind, this radioactive rubble, is 1, radioactive, and 2, physically hot. So what that means is that after about 3 years, the nuclear fuel has so much radioactive rubble that it can't be used anymore. And it's moved into the spent fuel pool. So the spent fuel pool has 3 purposes. The first is it keeps this radioactive rubble cool. The second is that it shields the people working above from the radiation from the radioactive rubble. And there's 20 feet of water over this stuff to shield the workers that are above it. It's highly radioactive. And the third is that it contains boron to to avoid the possibility of a nuclear chain reaction starting up again. So the three purposes of a fuel pool are to cool, to shield, and to prevent a chain reaction. So that's the big atom, that's the uranium atom. Now let's go to the opposite end of the spectrum and talk about hydrogen. The hydrogen is the smallest atom, and it's got one proton. Let's see if I can do this right. One proton and an electron that goes around it. It has a weight of 1 compared to 235. So that one proton has a positive charge, the electron's negative, and it goes around. Well, sometimes hydrogen mutates and becomes tritium. And tritium still has that one proton, but it has 2 neutral charge neutrons as well. It's 3 times heavier than the initial hydrogen atom, but it still has that one electron that zips around it. And so chemically, tritium is no different than hydrogen. They both have one electron to cause the chemical reactions. So it's also unstable. That means it's radioactive. So hydrogen is not, hydrogen stays in its form, but tritium decays over time. And what does that mean? It's unstable. It means that on average, within 12 years, half of it will disappear. Half of it will decay away. And in the process, it'll give off a radioactive bullet. And that bullet is called a beta particle. While it exists, it can form chemical bonds with other atoms. So tritium is a form of hydrogen. There's no difference in it chemically, but it weighs more. But it behaves like hydrogen chemically. So, for instance, let's assume that this is a water molecule. We got an H and an H and an O, H2O. Okay. Now, what happens with tritium is that one of those becomes heavier. It's a tritium and a hydrogen and oxygen, and it's called HTO. So tritiated water is water that has one tritium, one hydrogen, and one oxygen, whereas tritium is just a standalone atom of hydrogen. What's in the fuel pool at Indian Point is tritiated water, a tritium, a hydrogen, and an oxygen molecule. The other thing that tritium can do is it can hook up with a carbon atom, and there's 4 hydrogens and a large carbon atom, and one of those can be radioactive, and that's called organically bound tritium, and that's even worse than tritiated water. There's a good discussion. I think it'll be in a link to this presentation on the Fairwinds website with Dr. Ian Fairley. Maggie and I and one of the Fairwinds staff talked with Dr. Fairley for about 40 minutes on his concerns about tritium, and he's an international expert, and I really won't go too far on that. Now, it's important to remember that tritium occurs naturally. Tritium is formed as cosmic rays bombard the Earth, and about 1 in a quadrillion atoms of tritium in water are tritiated water. 1 in a quadrillion atoms in water are tritium naturally. That's the natural background on Earth because cosmic rays are creating it. Now, the EPA limit for tritium is 750 times higher than that. Now, you'll hear terms thrown around about 20,000 picocuries per liter, concentrations and stuff like that. What I like to deal with is something called a becquerel. And 1 becquerel is a disintegration every second. So in nature, a liter, you know what a liter bottle is, right? a liter of water in nature, just go up in the Catskills and take a nice bottle of water out of one of the freshwater streams, that will be disintegrating at 1 disintegration every second from the natural occurring tritium that's coming down from the sky. Now, the EPA limit would say that it's acceptable to drink that bottle if it had 740 disintegrations per second. The water in the fuel pool is hotter still, and it is more radioactive. And so and that water in that pool has been there for 50 years. So over time, where does tritium come from? It's naturally made, we talked about that, but it's also man-made in nuclear reactors. One of the products of the nuclear chain reaction is tritium. It's called a tertiary product. But the other part of it is it comes from boron. So the boron that's in the pool to prevent the chain reaction from occurring creates more tritium. And the boron that's in the reactor coolant creates more tritium as well. So the tritium concentration in the pool is much higher than the tritium concentration that EPA would let you drink, and the EPA limit is 700 times higher than what Mother Nature has in the water. Now, the health effects of tritium are something that hopefully the other speakers may touch on, and again, I refer you to Dr. Ian Fairley and the extensive interview that Maggie and I had with Dr. Fairley about tritium. But let me say this, the nuclear industry says that tritium is a weak beta emitter. And what that means is that its radioactive bullet is weaker than something like cesium or strontium or something like that. But what they don't tell you is that it still can travel more than the length of DNA double helix. So if a water molecule is next to a DNA double helix and it decays, that tritium, that beta particle, even though it's weak, even though it doesn't travel real far, is going to hit that double helix and destroy it and do genetic damage. So the spent fuel pool we already talked about has 1 million gallons or more of tritiated water in it, whose concentration is thousands of times higher than the EPA allows. Now, I did a paper, Fairman's did a paper, Maggie and I did a paper for Hudson Riverkeeper. And we looked at the tritium releases from Indian Point. Of course, Unit 1 had a leaky fuel pool and has leaked not just tritium, but strontium and cesium into the groundwater around the plant. Now, because you're not drinking that water, the EPA limits don't apply, but it's higher than the EPA limits. Unit 2 has also had a leak in the fuel pool, and again, next to the buildings, there's tritium in the soil at concentrations that are higher than the EPA would let you drink. But because it's an owner-controlled situation, the EPA doesn't seem to mind. But there's a couple of interesting phenomena that I discovered in the report for Riverkeeper, and that's that the fuel pool evaporates. Not the water isn't just static. Some water evaporates into the atmosphere and gets sucked out through fans out the plant stack. Now remember, tritium can't be treated. It's chemically identical to water. So they have found, this is Entergy found, tritium in puddles on the site. Now, where did that came from? It came out the site, and they call the phenomena rainout, where the tritium then lays on the soil and forms tritiated water on the site. They also found it in the condensate from air conditioners. You know, when you walk by an air conditioner in the summer and it drips, Well, that's concentrating the water that's in the air. And of course, if there's tritium in the air, there's going to be tritium in the condensate. So for several decades now, Indian Point has been releasing tritiated water directly into the atmosphere around the plant. This happened at Vermont Yankee as well, and every other power plant in the country releases on order of 5,000 gallons of tritiated water a day during refueling outages. So you have a school nearby. It would have been important to sample the runoff on a humid day, not a rainy day, but a humid day where you get the water on your windshield or something like that, and look for tritium. But the NRC doesn't require it, and of course the licensees aren't going to want that to happen. Now, how is the fuel pool treated? If you look at those fuel pools, the water is beautiful. It's crystal clear. Well, they filter it and take all the dust out that may be in it, and then they basically connect it to a fancy Brita filter, much larger, but the concept is the same. They take out the ionic things, the chemicals like cesium and strontium, but they can't take out tritium, because tritium is tritiated water is water. So it flows right through. There's no way to separate out the tritium from the tritiated water from all the water in the fuel pool. Let me just catch up on myself here. Okay, so then the question is, what are you going to do about it? And there's three alternatives. It can't be filtered. And even there's other radioactive material in the pool that can be filtered out. And the filters get about 90, maybe 95% of that. They don't get it all. So a release of the spent fuel pool won't just release tritiated water. It will release other things like cesium and strontium. Strontium's a bone seeker, causes a lot of leukemia and brain cancers, and cesium is a muscle seeker. So the filtration is not going to take it out. But there's three solutions. The first solution is the cheap one, the one that Holtec wants to do, and that's dump it into the Hudson River. There's this old adage we had in the nuclear industry: dilution is the solution to pollution. But the fact of the matter is they plan to dump 1 million gallons of radioactive water into the Hudson, and count that at some point downstream or upstream, it's going to dilute with the Hudson River flow and not be measurable. It is measurable in the pool, and it will be 700 times higher than Mother Nature's limit if it's released at the EPA limit. And I'm not convinced the EPA limit is safe. Again, we'll take a look at Dr. Fairley's report on that. So number one, dilution is a solution to pollution. That's the cheap way, and that's the way Holtec wants to go. The second way is what they did at Vermont Yankee. Vermont Yankee, because Vermont has very tough environmental laws, was a zero liquid discharge plant. It discharged nothing into the river. And what Vermont Yankee did was they shipped the radioactive tritiated water in tanker trucks down to a licensed facility in Tennessee. That's open to Holtec, but it costs money. So they can move it by tanker truck to an NRC licensed facility. And they've chosen just financially not to do that. So, and the third option is keep the fuel pool. There's two reasons to keep the fuel pool. One is when Entergy was making money, and Con Ed before them, they had the pool for 50 years, and it didn't seem to be a hindrance. Now, they were making money, and the fuel pool was part of that money-making venture. Well, now with Holtec, Holtec makes money by knocking things down. So it's not in Holtec's, not the Holtec's advantage to keep that pool functioning. But one, it doesn't release the tritium, and in about 120 years, that's 10 half-lives, 12-year half-life times 10, about 120 years, there will be 1,000th of the tritium that's there right now today remaining. And at that point, it's essentially could be released. But the second reason is that the NRC does not require you to have a facility if a fuel cask were to be breached, or to start to leak, or to develop a crack. There's no requirement for the NRC to have anything to do with that fuel cask. Now, if the spent fuel pool was still there, it could be put back into that facility where it could be worked on in a controlled manner. So I've been an advocate out in California and elsewhere to keep the fuel pool until there's a point when the fuel is ultimately sent to a radiological repository. So you can dump it, that's the cheapest. You can truck it, which is more expensive, or you can keep the fuel pool and let the stuff decay. And frankly, either of those last two alternatives, to my mind, are better than what Holtec is proposing.
Okay, thanks again, Ani, for that, for letting us use your presentation to Indian Point. I think that, we can also possibly consider in Plymouth the possibility, or Holtec can consider the possibility of also storing the water there. After all, the dry fuel casks are going to be stored on site for an indefinite period of time, probably many, many tens of years, since there's no way to get rid of them. Personally, I don't see why it's a problem storing the radioactive water in a spent fuel pool for the same period of time. And it's also a backup safety sort of thing that you could do. I guess you would agree, Ani.
Yeah, I would agree. I like my presentation. It's my first time I ever got to watch myself give a presentation. But I would add two things. Holtec has never operated a nuclear reactor. They're a decommissioning contractor. The people that operate it, Entergy or whomever, sell the carcass to Holtec, and Holtec's job is to knock it down. So they don't have health physicists to determine the effect of that water on the community. They don't have an engineering staff who's ever operated a nuclear power plant. Their job is to make money by knocking the plant down. And of course, they take a profit along the way. So it's to their advantage to get rid of that pool as quickly as possible, because they can get the profit from that dismantlement. There's literally nobody on their staff who's done power plant engineering, because they're a dismantlement contractor. And the other thing I would add is a good way of remembering about, we call it a tritium release, but it's really tritiated water. And I'll go back to that symbol I made. A hydrogen and oxygen and a tritium atom. And you can think of it as HOT, hot. It's physically radioactive and hence hot. And I'll save my other comments for the end of the presentation.
There you go. Thanks, Arnie. I think I should also add something to your video also. In that tritiated water, since it is water, if it does get inside your body, it can go anywhere that water does. And as everybody probably knows, water can go right through the blood-brain barrier. It can also go right through the placenta of pregnant women into the developing embryo and fetus, which makes things very, very difficult in terms of potential damage to the DNA. So given that, I'll ask again that if the Board of Health members have any questions for Arnie, please just raise your hand or just unmute yourself. And then we'll go on to invite Dr. Britta Lundberg to make a presentation with a couple of slides.
Barry, it's Amy. I do have a question. When you bring the tritiated water to the NRC treatment plant, what do they do to that water?
Well, it's a licensed disposal site, and they use it in other processes and evaporate it in small concentrations over a long period of time. And it's discharged to the atmosphere in an area that is much more remote than the area around Cape Cod. But it is ultimately discharged at the NRC approved disposal facility.
Yeah, Arnie, I was under the impression also that they actually mix it with clay and allow it to settle into the clay and then actually bury the material for quite some time. Is that true?
Yes.
So there's multiple ways to try to deal with it.
Yeah.
And then I just have one more question about if the water was kept on site in Plymouth, you said, was it 12 years? It would go down to, non-radiated water? That's it.
Tritium has a 12-year half-life. So half of it is gone in 12 years. And then in 24 years, 3/4 of it is gone, another half. And in 36 years, an eighth, and so on. So the rule of thumb is if you keep it for 10 half-lives, it's essentially roughly 1,000 times lower in concentration.
And when that degrades naturally as a radioactive waste, what happens to that extra bond, the tritium, does it just evaporate? Is that how it happens?
Yeah. If it was tritiated water, this hydrogen, which is tritium, would decay away and become another atom, and tritium decays to helium, which is non-radioactive. So the decay from tritium to the next item, the next element, creates a non-radioactive element.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Arnie. If you could hang around, there may be more questions after the other videos. So our next speaker is Dr. Britta Lundberg, and I just wanted to show you something that I found when I was searching a variety of different things. So I'm going to screen share that just very, very briefly because actually Britta is the chair of the Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. And this is their webpage. And what I wanted to point out to you is what it says here: we must prevent what we cannot cure. Guided by the values and expertise of medicine and public health, we work to protect human life from the gravest threats to health and survival. So that's something I certainly agree with. Obviously, the Board of Health has a similar sort of working model, and we share with the physicians group the responsibility to do everything we can to protect the public health of the people and the visitors here in Plymouth. So given that, I'd like to introduce Britta, and if you would like to screen share, you can, I believe, assuming that that's set up so that you can do so. So please go ahead, Britta. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Barry. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Slideshow. All right. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. I am Dr. Britta Lundberg. I'm chair of the board at Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. I'm an infectious disease doctor and an internist. Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility is a physician-led group of professionals and community members working to address, as Barry said, the twin existential threats to human health: nuclear weapons development and climate change. Our members include nationally recognized experts in public health, cancer epidemiology, occupational medicine, environmental health, emergency medicine, and disaster preparedness. It looks like this might be covering. There we go. Well, so one of GBPSR's members is Dr. Richard Clapp, who is Professor Emeritus at the BU School of Public Health and former Massachusetts State Cancer Epidemiologist. Professor Clapp shared with me that the Massachusetts Cancer Registry was created in 1980 due to the excess number of cancer cases and excess mortality, the proximity to the Pilgrim nuclear, due to the proximity of the community to the nuclear power plant. There was, he said, an increased signal for leukemia from the time the nuclear power plant first went into operation. Clapp found, as Barry mentioned, a fourfold excess leukemia cases among nuclear power plant workers, according to Clapp, the worst in the nuclear industry in terms of overexposure of workers to radiation at that time. And a case control study that he did showed increased infant mortality, thyroid cancer, and leukemia was 75% more frequent in the 1982 to 84 period in that community, an effect that was again attributable to the presence of the nuclear power plant. So fast forward to the present, now the plant is decommissioned and the new operator, Holtec, wishes to dispose of over, as Betty have said, over 1 million gallons of radioactive waste from the holding pools into Cape Cod Bay. So what are the potential health risks of this action? Well, there are several. First, as many have mentioned, risks to marine life. One of the known radioactive, I was going to say contaminants, but I realized that that is not the correct, according to Dr. Gunderson, the correct thing to say. Radioactive elements in this water is tritium, which can achieve concentrations in mussels and benthic fish 1,000 times higher than the H2O concentration in the water. Risks to humans, both from ingesting the fish and mollusks, since the increased radioactivity will travel up the food chain, and humans can also absorb it via direct assimilation from swimming in and absorbing the radioactive water. Then I would like to point that there are going to be unknown but certain health risks due to the cumulative effects with other pollutants, which will be magnified because of the radioactive material will persist in the environment, as Dr. Gunderson mentioned, for over more than a century. And then unknown effects of other radioactive isotopes that might be present in the wastewater. Holtec has said there are no other elements there, but as many have pointed out, these might be present, but below the limits of detection of the tests that Holtec has used. So a few background words on tritium, just very quickly, because Dr. Gunderson has covered this superlatively. Tritium, as many of you know, is the radioactive isotope of hydrogen. Because the tritium atom can exchange with hydrogen in organic molecules like water, it makes the water radioactive. And tritium's really unique in this. Since it makes the water radioactive, that means that whatever living organisms absorb that water, plants, animals, essentially our food, will likewise become radioactive, as will we, since that radioactivity will move up the food chain into humans. Tritium has a relatively short half-life of 12.5 years, but materials with short half-lives like iodine-131 at 8 days are intensely radioactive. So for a given mass, for instance, tritium is roughly 150,000 times as radioactive in terms of disintegrations per unit time as plutonium-239. Tritium is a persistent pollutant. It's estimated to persist in the environment for up to 130 years, and it's a potent pollutant. Very little of it is required to contaminate water to the EPA limit. Just a teaspoon of tritiated water as H2O could contaminate about 100 billion gallons of water to that US drinking water limit. Tritium, as many have said, is particularly problematic because unlike most radioactive contaminants, it cannot be filtered out of the water since it's incorporated into the water molecule. So what are the potential negative health effects? I just thought I'd first mention that the negative health effects of radiation have obviously long been recognized, but I think it's important to recognize how even a small amount of radiation exposure can have significant health consequences. So Dr. Alice Stewart's work in England in the 1960s made clear the harms of radiation exposure to the developing fetus. She showed that a single maternal X-ray in a pregnant woman, which used to be standard practice until the 1980s to determine the position of the fetus, doubled the risk of subsequent childhood leukemia in the in children. One X-ray is equivalent to 2 millirems of radiation. The allowed level of radiation from tritium, according to EPA, is 4 millirems a year. That's roughly 2 chest X-rays. So tritium is in a way a more insidious form of radiation, though, than a chest X-ray, because it's, as Dr. Gunderson mentioned, a so-called internal emitter, which means, according to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, that it has a greater ability to penetrate tissues because it's readily incorporated into the body. It's taken up especially avidly by the respiratory passages, bone surfaces, and into bone marrow. It crosses the placenta and concentrates in the fetus at higher levels than in the mother. According to the Algon National Laboratory in France, ingested tritium dioxide is also almost completely absorbed, moving quickly from the gastrointestinal tract into the bloodstream. Within minutes, it's found in varying concentration in body fluids, organs, and other tissues. There are, unfortunately, few studies of the health effects of tritium alone, because in general, it keeps company with many other potent radioactive isotopes. But the clinical studies that do exist have shown signals for increased leukemia, prostate and kidney cancer, and in vitro data in animal models show various biologic effects known to trigger cancer, including DNA strand breaks, cell death or apoptosis, and chromosomal abnormalities. The most recent study I could find of tritiated water in humans was in human umbilical vein endothelial cells, and it likewise showed significant cellular damage with increased cell death, decreased cell adhesion, which is important for healthy blood vessels, and decreased ability to form new blood vessels. So I think the bottom line here is really there is no safe level of radiation exposure. So like other environmental pollutants, like the air pollutant PM 2.5, heavy metals like lead, volatile organic compounds like benzene, there's no threshold for the negative health effects of radiation. The scientific consensus is that every additional exposure to radiation adds to the total risk for genetic damage, and thus for cancers like leukemia. Increased radiation necessarily implies increased incidence of these diseases in exposed populations. For solid cancers, the risk of cancer from radiation is linearly proportional to exposure. There is no threshold or safe dose of tritium that has been scientifically established for any of these effects. For all these reasons, UN experts recently opposed the Japanese decision to release radioactive wastewater at Fukushima. In addition to tritium, they are concerned that the water may contain quantities of radioactive carbon-14, as well as other isotopes, including strontium-90. So in 1997, the director of the EPA Office of Radiation and Indoor Air, Ramona Travato, said, to put it bluntly, radiation should not be treated as a privileged pollutant. You and I should not be exposed to higher risks from radiation sites than we should be from sites which contained any other environmental pollutant. So what did she mean by that? She meant that then, as now, the guidelines for radioactive pollution allow for 1 excess cancer death for every 100 people exposed. Or cancer, just 1 excess cancer for every 100 people exposed. That is 100 to 10,000 times the standard acceptable risk level for all other carcinogens. I think to protect public health, we as a society have an obligation to, above all, do no harm by preventing exposure of our fellow humans to highly hazardous substances and to protect the marine environment to which human health and well-being is so closely tied. It's clear that radioactive isotopes in this water have the potential to move up the food chain and affect plant life, fish, and humans. The radioactive hazards of tritium could pose risks to human and the environment for over 100 years, and those negative health effects will be magnified by other pollutants that have overlapping toxicities. As the former EPA director stated, treating radiation as a privileged pollutant is harmful to health. According to Professor Dick Clapp, there's no safe level of radiation exposure, so no additional releases to the Plymouth Harbor are warranted. There's no need to repeat history here. The lessons of the early years of this reactor are fresh enough and should be paid heed. This community deserves better. Releasing this radioactive contaminated water is a risk to health and safety, and as Dr. Clapp has said, an unacceptable one. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Lundberg. That was a very powerful presentation. I'm sure everyone will agree. I'd like to follow up on the statement that I showed originally about your organization and their stated purpose and goals. I applaud anyone and any group that has a concern for social responsibility. And I think there are some, but unfortunately not an awful lot of large companies that actually share that feeling. But there should be such a thing as corporate responsibility so that they do as little harm as possible, just as we always strive to do for our communities. So that's just my statement from my heart as a member of the Board of Health and as someone who's devoted my life to the studies of these sorts of things. Again, I'd like to ask if any of the board members have questions for Dr. Lundberg. Then we'll move on with some further studies about what happens to women specifically and children.
Yeah, Barry, it's Dave. Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Lundberg. I just wanted to restate something that stood out to me, and I want to make sure that I'm correct. You said that there's been no scientific consensus about the safe level of exposure to tritium. Is that correct?
So there have been no studies in humans, live subjects. So it would be unethical to do a case control study where you gave one group of persons just tritium and the other with no tritium. So the studies that have been done, tritium has been present, but often other radioactive isotopes have been present too. And so therefore, companies that say that tritium is safe, they really can't say that because it would be unethical to do that study. And the studies that we have suggest everything to the opposite, right? Because you have data, laboratory data from animals, from using human cells, showing that tritiated water, HTO, produces DNA damage. And then you have clinical studies that show that tritium in workers, as well as other radioactive pollutants, have all sorts of carcinogenic and other endpoints. And so I don't think you'll ever have that study, except under like an authoritarian dictatorship, maybe.
Sure, because it
would be completely unethical, right?
Unethical, and it would result in the deaths of human beings.
Correct. So that is why I made that statement, yes.
Yet we want to dump 1 million gallons of this where we swim and fish and provide food for people around the country.
Unacceptable.
Anyone else on the board like to ask a question of Dr. Lundberg before we move on? Okay.
Barry, someone raised their hand on the Zoom call. I don't know if we're taking from.
It's Mike.
I'm looking for the.
Hi, Barry. It's Mike
Jackman.
Okay.
Sorry.
Right, go ahead.
Just
Mike.
a quick question for Dr. Lundberg. And I might have misheard you, but I think you mentioned that the tritium levels could be above what is allowable by the EPA. Is that correct? Did you reference the EPA? Because my understanding is that the EPA does not regulate radioactivity?
I can recheck that. That was from a recent paper that I saw. I saw 4 millirems referenced. I
Okay,
defer to Professor Gunderson.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there anyone?
Arnie's got his hand up too. Go ahead, Arnie. You've got to unmute yourself though.
Just wanted to also say, anyone in the audience here, we do have a number of people. If you have a question, raise your hand.
The EPA does set drinking water standards for tritium. You can have more tritium in the groundwater on a nuclear site than is the drinking water standard because you're not drinking that water. But EPA does establish the numbers. There's a line between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the EPA, and that line is the site boundary. EPA can't go inside the site boundary and dictate the amount of radiation in a building, for instance. But once that radiation migrates out over the site boundary, then it's beyond the NRC's jurisdiction and it falls over to EPA. And one other thing, Dr. Lundberg, I have a bachelor's and master's, but I don't have a doctorate. Wrote a book and peer-reviewed papers and yada, yada, yada. But I just wanted to correct.
Did I promote you?
Yes, thanks for the promotion.
Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, thank you. Arnie, if I had the power, I would put you up for an honorary degree, an honorary doctoral degree at any of the colleges that I have taught at or attended, but I don't know I have the power. So Margaret, if you'd like to move along to the next video, which was the one by Dr. Kathleen Nolan, who is a pediatrician. And I think she gets introduced at the beginning of her video also.
Which forum is that from, please? Is that from
That's
the
the one-
January or February?
That's from, no, that's from the one you currently have up. That's February 16th.
Thank
So
you.
just scroll down and you'll find Kathleen Nolan. It's number 2, you just went by it.
Mary Olson, you said?
Yeah, keep going up, that's Mary Olson, go a couple more up, not down, up. Right there, part 2, Dr. Kathy Nolan.
Dr. Nolan is a pediatrician, bioethicist, and president of Physicians for Social Responsibility of New York. She's the co-founder of Concerned Health Professionals of New York and an Ulster County legislator. She said exposure to even very low levels of radiation is more dangerous than previously estimated, especially for women, children, and during prenatal life. Thank you, Dr. Nolan, for joining us today and really helping us to understand the risks we are facing here around Indian Point. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your introduction and the introduction of County Executive Latimer. I wanted to note that Megan Gander from U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer's office also noted in the chat that she's present here today, so appreciate that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about potential health impacts and how we evaluate them and think about them, especially in relationship to this decommissioning effort. Health assessment sounds like something that could be very simple. Is it going to be harmful or is it not? However, in order to know the answers to those kinds of questions, we need to look deeper. So the assessment of what the impacts will be on human health of a particular action need to address what toxins, what concentrations or doses, what routes of exposure, what populations, and in what condition would a person who might be receiving such an exposure be in. The way that many regulatory agencies view these kinds of questions is to look at standard guidelines and reference values. for whether or not a particular exposure would be problematic. But those standard guidelines and reference values really are derived from analysis of average, often just white adult males. So those kinds of reference values can give us an initial starting point for analyzing what impacts may be, but they don't tell the whole story. Children and embryos and fetuses during prenatal development, and women and elderly populations and people with pre-existing conditions have unique susceptibilities, and they often require, but do not often receive, extra protection. I want to talk about the radioactivity that we are concerned about in relationship to other kinds of toxins or contaminants that may be present in our environment and cause harm, because I think it gives us a sense of the specific problems related to these specific agents. So toxins or contaminants can be considered in 5 main categories. They can be infectious, like the flu. They can be caustic, like a burn or blunt trauma. They can be mutagenic, which means that they cause abnormalities or changes in DNA or RNA in cells. They can be cancerogenic, or carcinogenic, which means that they cause cancers, sometimes by causing those changes in the DNA or RNA, but sometimes through other mechanisms. And they can be what's called teratogenic, which means causing an abnormal growth. Radioactive agents are caustic, mutagenic, cancerous, and teratogenic agents. In terms of being cancerous agents, that's particularly problematic for young children, because young children are growing rapidly, and growth requires precise cell-to-cell communication for proper development, particularly of the nervous system. Children frequently also receive greater exposure, basically higher doses of toxins that are in air, water, and soil, because children are breathing quickly and they have greater contact with dust and soil because they don't wash their hands as frequently, and often their hands go into their mouths. So there are routes of exposure that are particular to children that we don't see in adults. Embryos and fetuses are uniquely susceptible to the harmful effects from teratogenic agents. Cells during early intrauterine life are dividing and changing at extraordinary rates, and even tiny doses of agents that can disrupt DNA, RNA, or cell-to-cell communication can pose disastrous consequences. It's really a miracle when development proceeds normally and a child is born that has 10 fingers and toes, and all organs are properly aligned and functioning. Even tiny disruptions early in life can mean major consequences. Harmful agents can pass through the placenta to the embryo or fetus, and sometimes are even concentrated there. So every aspect of early development, being an integrated choreography of cell specialization and growth, can be upset, and normal development can be prevented by what to adults might be minor disrupting influences. So radioactive agents are not minor disrupting influences. Even at tiny doses, they can have major impacts. And they pose specific threats to children and to embryos and fetuses, and as we'll hear, to other vulnerable populations. These effects have not been fully studied. So when we are trying to determine what is a good course of action to take, what we ought to do as moral agents, we need to have information to guide those decisions. And much of that information is not available, especially for these vulnerable populations and for cumulative impacts. For example, for children who are at a schoolyard that might be repeatedly exposed, and families that might be taking in water that they're drinking in and bathing in and showering in. So there are ways to evaluate these impacts. A formal, comprehensive health impact assessment would lay out all the factors and require gathering of information and data on every element that I've been discussing and more. And that's really what should be done before any potentially harmful action would be taken. If that kind of study is not contemplated, then we should operate under the precautionary principle. If we don't know enough to know that it's safe, it's harmful, and we should consider it harmful and not do it. And I would just say, in relationship to the adage, dilution is the solution to pollution, that if the dilution is the solution, it is pollution. So I'll stop there in the interest of time and hope that we're able to come to questions that people may have.
Thank you, Dr. Nolan. You really succinctly shared all that information. There are several questions about what you were talking about. One,
Margaret, I think you can stop the video
how
and
do
stop
we
the
know
screen share. Because we have one more to get through, and I want to leave time for questions. We don't have, as far as I know, Dr. Nolan present. I don't see her on the list of attendees, so she's not able to answer questions right now. But the next presentation by Mary Olson, she's not here either. But we do have Cindy Folkers, who was recommended by Mary Olson to answer questions on her particular video. So we'll go ahead and start that video, and then we can open up the rest of the meeting to questions.
Because both my kids went to Buchanan Verplank Elementary.
Yeah, it's number 4. If you could just start number 4 and stop the other one.
What we should be concerned about in terms of the school children and exposure.
Well,
yeah,
it's
the
number
February one.
4. Yep, it's number 4 on the list. I think you're in the wrong one. It looks, you have to go to the February 6th form, 16th form. There you go. It's number 4, Mary Olson. Thank you.
Next and last speaker is Mary Olson. She's the founder and director of the Gender and Radiation Impact Project called GRIP. GRIP is dedicated to education and expanding understanding of the disproportionate harm from exposure to ionizing radiation suffered by the biological female body compared to the biological male. Olson made an original independent finding on gender differences in cancer rates in 2011 while working as a staff biologist for the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. Her training is in evolutionary biology, and her current goal is to spur institutions of excellence to pursue many research questions, not the least being why biological sex is a factor in radiation harm. Thank you, Mary Olson, for joining us today. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen to have some slides. Hopefully I can do this quickly. Okay, I think these are all going to be posted. So if I'm moving fairly quickly, I put the links in so that you have them from posting. So we've been talking about radiation, ionizing radiation. It is invisible, but we can see the harm it does to chromosomes. And each of these different types of damage is what we're going to be talking about. If a reproductive cell is damaged, deformation is one outcome. However, much more common is catastrophic damage, which prevents reproduction altogether. And it may be prior to fertilization in the ova or spermatogonia, or it may be once fertilization occurs, often so early in pregnancy that it only shows up in our awareness as infertility. And I think that's a big clue people should be spending a lot more time studying, is infertility rates in high radiation exposure areas. However, our soma, our body, the somatic impacts are what we're mostly going to focus on when talking about at least half of this talk. So in this picture, we see the radiation coming in on the left side. When it hits a living cell, One of the primary types of damage is to the DNA, as Arnie said. If you have a particle or a wave of radiation, it can actually break the DNA. Now, our body has repair mechanisms, one of which is to simply absorb a dying cell if the cell is damaged to that point. So the problem is when there's cellular damage, DNA damage that is not fully repaired or not repaired correctly, that may over time, not in every case, become a malignancy, a cancer, and cause the terrible suffering that we see every day. This is just a nod to Arnie Gunderson, who you've heard, and also Dr. Ian Fairley, who he referenced. These are the links to that podcast, and they have certainly taught me a lot of what I know about tritium, and I count as good friends in life. This slide is split in half. On the left side is a picture that shows that different types of ionizing radiation penetrate to different degrees, and beta particles go about 1 centimeter in water or in flesh. They're not penetrating the way gamma and fast neutrons are. And that is part of why our regulators dismiss them, because in the work environment, they are thought to be no big deal. Unfortunately, once they get inside our body, if the radioactive emission, that beta particle, happens inside our bodies, then the outcomes are very different. Now, the slide on the right just basically shows that water, which we've already heard, radioactive hydrogen can form a water molecule and move through our environment, or it can stay as a gas and move through our environment and be taken up by plants and animals, which become our food. Unlike some other radionuclides, however, they don't concentrate as many times as some of the metals do, but this is how we get the internal exposures, is through breathing, drinking, and eating. So we saw Arnie make a beautiful little water molecule with his hand. Here are water molecules linked together with the hydrogen bonds. Any of those hydrogens can be radioactive tritium. And as Arnie said, the half-life is 12.33 years, but that's only half of the material is gone in that amount of time. And we're going to talk about gone in a second. The hazardous period is 10 to 20 times that. So 120 to 220 years is where you can still find traces of any release of tritium still in the environment. So half goes in 12.33 years, half goes of what's left at that point in another 12.33 years and on down through time. You still have traces even a couple hundred years into the future. Now, this water cycle picture is why dilution is viewed as the solution. And I'm going to hurry on to another slide after this one that tells you why that doesn't really apply to tritium. In part, the concern is the binding of tritium to something besides water. This is because when that particle, the beta particle, comes out, the tritium isn't tritium anymore. It decays to helium. And so if in our food or our drinking water, the tritium has become bound into someplace like the DNA, when that beta comes flying out, it can break the DNA strands nearby, but the tritium atom itself is now gone. And the chemical properties of the next element in the decay chain, this one is the final element, just one step in this decay chain, is helium. And helium's chemical properties are completely different. Now, this one the regulator never talks about. What happens to the biochemistry as decay occurs? We don't have any studies that I'm aware of that can tell you this story. We need to know it. Because here's the key thing, tritium doesn't concentrate through a food chain, but it goes everywhere. Just like it can't be filtered out of the fuel pool, it can't be filtered by the blood-brain barrier. It goes right into places where only water can go. And that is into our brains. Blood doesn't go there, water goes there, it carries the nutrients to the brain. And if it's radioactive water, it brings those beta particle emissions right in. And the second place that the water goes that nothing else can go is across the placental barrier. If a woman is pregnant, the placenta is there to protect the developing embryo and uterus, fetus, excuse me, misspoke, the developing embryo and fetus. And the International Commission on Radiological Protection, the global body called the ICRP, acknowledges that because the fetus is growing, the radioactivity, the hydrogen, collects there twice as fast as in the maternal tissue. So, as I've said, it can get bound, it can go into proteins, it can go into nucleic acids, including DNA, and the bound tritium stays in the body about twice as long as radioactive water, because in addition to a half-life, you have a biological half-life. Water doesn't stay in your body for 12.33 years. It generally moves through in a couple weeks. But the bound tritium stays about twice as long and therefore can give about twice the level of radiation exposure. And because it stays longer, it's more likely to decay and cause that biochemical chaos that I just mentioned. So we talked about, Arnie mentioned, how does it get out of a reactor? I'm going to direct you to Dr. Ian Fairley's work on the opening of the reactor vessel. It's a tremendously important piece that Indian Point no longer has. Other reactors that are still operating do have, and is really important. But I'm going to jump now because I was asked to talk about the disproportionate impact on female bodies, and it's not a beta emitter finding. It's a gamma and neutron finding. And so I can't talk about it in terms of this fuel pool question in the Hudson River. I need to take you to the original source material, because unfortunately, no institution of excellence has yet picked up the research questions associated with these findings. But it's in the NAS, Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, or BEER 7 report is where the numbers that I looked at are. And they correspond to 60 years of tracking the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the 1945 US attack on Japan with the very first nuclear weapons. And I just have to say that it rends my heart every time. These are people's lives. This picture is not a picture of a nuclear bomb. This is a picture of Hiroshima, the city itself, moments before it was a city, and now it's a cloud. So I'm just going to whip right through this because we're short on time. I'd love to come back and talk more about these findings, where exactly they come from. But we knew way back then that radiation was more harmful to children. There are many reasons for this, but the primary is that children's bodies are growing. And when they're growing, the DNA is more vulnerable. The cells are dividing more frequently. And so radiation has a greater impact during those processes. So we knew that children would be more impacted by exposure to radiation. And this is now the flash of gamma and neutrons that came out of the A-bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. About 100,000 survivors were in the tracking, and this is 60 years later. They were grouped by the age they were in August 1945 in 5-year age cohorts. And I looked at the numbers of cancer incidents that came out from tracking them. And interestingly, they were disaggregated by biological sex, by girls and boys, men and women. And the big news, big news, is that those who were children in 1945 and suffered that radiation exposure, we knew they were going to have the most cancer, but what we didn't know is that the girls would have twice as much compared to the boys over 60 years. We don't show here the age they were when the cancer arrived. It's across the next 60 years. And for girls to have twice as much cancer outcome than boys, if you're doing any type of biological research, this is a showstopper. So I really hope the institutions of excellence are going to take this one up and answer the question why. We don't know why. But we do know that the effect persists across all the age groups. Every single group of females had more cancer than did males in the same age group. And this is now cancer death. When these people were exposed as adults, for every 2 men who died of cancer, 3 women died of cancer. And this is a bar chart, which I don't have time to explain how it's constructed. It is an extraction of the data, imagining as if everybody had the same radiation exposure so that you can compare the age and the biological sex. But you can see that the blue line being males and the red line being females, there is a difference in every age group. Females had more cancer across the boards, and the difference is greatest in young children. So the last comment is simply that girls are not a subpopulation. That's how EPA talks about all this, and NRC just uses a reference man, doesn't talk about girls or women at all in any of its regulations. But girls are an inextricable link in the human life cycle, and until we protect the human life cycle, we are not providing protection.
Okay, that's the last of the recorded videos. We have a little bit of time for questions, and I'm hoping that we still have someone on the table to answer questions about that last presentation. Oh, Cindy, you're still here. Good. So if anyone has some quick questions for Cindy about the last presentation or two, please go ahead. I'm looking for the orange hand sticking up in the boxes again. I don't see any. Does any of the board members have any questions? Lorenzo?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Thank you, Arnie Gunderson and Dr. Britta Lundberg, for your time today. My question is maybe more towards Arnie, but you know, any of the panelists can obviously speak to it. You mentioned that there's 3 options, right, to really dispose, for lack of a better term, the tritiated water. And I know that in the United States, there's quite a bit of operating nuclear reactors out there. Has any state that has been decommissioning nuclear reactors legislatively said, you need to do it this way? 2 out of the 3. Obviously, number 1 is not what we would like to see, the dumping, you know, dilution as the solution to pollution.
Well, yeah, this is Arnie Gunderson. I know that Vermont was a 0 discharge plant, Vermont Yankee. So everything that it, and some plants are not, but they committed to the state that they were not going to release anything into the Connecticut River back when they were operating. And Holtec assumed that responsibility when they bought the plant to knock it down. And what that meant is that all of the liquid waste was solidified and shipped by truck to a land disposal, except for the tritiated waste, which was routinely over many years shipped by tanker truck to a licensed disposal facility, I think in Tennessee. So I think you asked your question, has the state legislated it? Vermont had a special deal with the original owner of Vermont Yankee back in, I want to say, might have been 1971, that the plant's releases were below the NRC's allowable releases. And the owner agreed with Vermont that Vermont's laws would supersede. However, the legislative history on that, with the exception of Vermont, is that the NRC regulations supersede state regulations. States cannot regulate safety. But once it crosses that boundary, once it leaves the site, that's a different ballgame, and that becomes a Department of EPA criteria. So what goes on site is pretty well legally determined that the NRC has jurisdiction. But once it crosses the site boundary, the NRC clearly has no jurisdiction, and it becomes an EPA and state matter.
Thank you.
Barry, this is Amy. I have a question for Mr. Gunderson.
Sure.
So when we talk about the second option, trucking it, and you just said that that's what the plant in Vermont did, has there ever been any studies on cancer rates around the NRC treatment plants? Has anybody looked at that?
Okay, I don't know, but I do know that it is in a less populated area with a high stack, so that the discharges are dispersed into the atmosphere. And again, tritium is naturally occurring, so that at some point downwind, it becomes diluted. But the population density in the area in Tennessee where that plant is very much different than the population density in Vermont or Cape Cod or Indian Point.
Is
So
the solution?
I don't know if there's a study.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for the question. I can add to that a little bit. I do know that the Vermont Yankee decommissioning was undertaken by a company called North Star, not Holtec in this particular case. And I also realized when I was watching the videos from Indian Point, and it was brought up that one good solution that Arnie mentioned was to actually store the material on site in a spent fuel pool. And it was specifically asked of Holtec, because there's no additional cost for them to do that, or very little, just additional cost is in time, if they'd be willing to do it. And the answer from Holtec was, it was not in our business model. And I think that was a direct quote of one of the Holtec officials. So other things I'd like to add.
Barry, we have a question here in the room, several. If you'd like to come to the microphone and introduce yourself.
Hello, and thank you for the presentations. This is Mary Lampert from Pilgrim Watch from this area. I just wanted to respond to the question about state authority to enact regulations. I think what we're really talking about, does the state have, does the NRC have the final say? Is there preemption? And this is always thrown out, and it's a misconception. The NRC has authority over safety issues, but there have been 4 Supreme Court decisions on this issue. Oh, get carried away. The Supreme Court of the United States has ruled on this issue on whether the NRC has the trump card, the final say in these matters. The answer was no, they do not. They do not control all the fields. Way back in a PG&E case in California in 1970, I believe, it was established that states could establish regulations, had authority on matters of economic consequences in other, and that was held in all the cases. Furthermore, so in the case of this, with tritium being potentially dumped into Cape Cod Bay, you have economic consequences over $1 billion a year in marine blue economy, the blue economy itself. Second, the Supreme Court had ruled that if there is not a conflict between the state law and the federal law, so that a party, if they went with one, they'd be in conflict with another. If there is not a conflict, then there is not a problem. In this case of disposing water, the NRC does not have a rule that says Holtec or any site has to discharge the water. They gave them options. So in that case, in this case, our legislature is free to enact legislation if it is dealing not with economics rather, and they do not set up a conflict. And so I wanted to clarify that because I know Entergy and likely Holtec's lobbyists are very busy, as they were with Senator Moran's bill, with defeating it in the House, and time and time and time again, they confuse the legislators that they do not have authority to do it. That's wrong. Our governor, former Attorney General, said definitively that the state has authority to stop this.
Thank you for the comment. Yes.
Hi, my name's Dave Noyes. I'm the compliance manager for Holtec at Pilgrim. Dr. Potvin and the Board of Health, I want to thank you. I think the dialogue is important, and Holtec thinks that the dialogue is important as well. I do have a couple of questions, if I could, please. First, for Mr. Gunderson, you stated that 1 in a quadrillion water molecules are tritiated in nature. Was that right?
Yes, that was what I stated at the presentation a couple of weeks ago.
Thank you. So with a concentration of about 1 becquerel per liter, you said that 700 times that which is naturally occurring, you're not sure that that is a safe level. And that, I think, was a reference to allowable discharge limits with respect to radionuclides. Is that right?
I said that the EPA number was about 700 times the naturally occurring tritium number.
Okay. And my understanding, based on some data that I've seen, is that the generally accepted belief is that genetic effects occur at about 110 million times that background level of radiation of 110 million becquerels per liter. So is there some value? I assume that 1 becquerel per liter would be a safe value because that's what occurs in nature, right?
No, hang on. Every exposure to radiation is damaging. And this is what Beer 7 says, the biological effect of radiation. There is no de minimis number where you don't get cancer. I have no idea where you got that number of 100,000 million. It just doesn't make sense. So, yes, Mother Nature has a little bit of tritium in the atmosphere as a result of cosmic ray exposure, but 700 times as much increases the risk 700 times more, and 1,000 times. The risk is linear. It's called linear no threshold, so that the more radiation you get, the increase in cancer goes up linearly.
Just so you're aware, the increase that we're talking about of a potential release from Pilgrim is not 700 times, it's 2 times the background level, just so that you can be aware of the numbers and the amount of tritium that we're talking about. Also, with respect to the staff at the station, you indicated that Holtec, as opposed to an operating nuclear power plant, does not have engineers or health physicists that were familiar with the operating nature of a power plant. That's just not true, sir. So we have on staff certified health physicists that have been involved in operation of nuclear power plants and engineers that have as well. One of the most desirable aspects of Holtec being involved in decommissioning is that they will decommission the plant in a shorter period of time and make use of the resources that you talk about. I do have a question for Dr. Lundberg, if I could, please. You indicated that swimming in the water could result in direct exposure for personnel. My understanding is that tritium has very low energy and essentially is shielded by the dead skin layers on an individual, so that an individual, for a person swimming to actually be exposed to tritium, that they would need to either ingest the liquid or they would have to inhale vapors, tritium vapors. Would that be accurate?
It's my understanding that it can be actually absorbed through the skin. It acts like water, and you absorb water through the skin. Also, when people swim, they do tend to ingest some water, especially young children who are most at risk, right? And so, and also water vapor on a humid day, the ocean is going to be putting out a certain amount of water vapor, which will be inhaled. So I would not say at all that it would not be a risk. Correct.
Okay, thank you. And just with respect to tritium concentrations, I do want to make sure, Dr. Potvin, that you are aware that the amount of tritium that we're talking about potentially being released in that 1.1 million gallons of water is less than the tritium concentration in 2 exit signs from 1960, 1970 vintage exit signs that are used and contain tritium. I was wondering if maybe we had looked at Plymouth public buildings, including schools, to find out whether they contain hazardous levels of tritium for our kids.
Let me respond to some of the things you said, and I'll try to answer that last question too. First of all, Dave, you said you have health physicists. Do you have any radiation biologists or medically trained consultants?
Not, but that was not the point that Mr. Gunderson made. Those would not be individuals who would be on a staff of an operating power plant either.
Okay, well, another question I have, actually, it's a statement that I don't know if you agree or not. A lot of the older studies that were done go back anywhere from 20 to 50 years. A lot of the published work I saw goes back about 15 to 20 years. A lot has happened since that time. And an awful lot of the studies were done on the effects of external exposure to radiation. What wasn't taken into consideration is ingestion, inhalation, or absorption of these radioactive molecules. And certainly there's very little studies that you can find anywhere about what happens when these things bioaccumulate and become organically bound. So in looking through all this stuff, trying to be fair about what I was seeing and reading, it seemed apparent to me that a lot of what Holtec has been doing and saying really is based upon outdated studies that have not taken into consideration the most recent scientific data. Other thing that really bothered me an awful lot was when Dr. James Conker came, I guess at Holtec's invitation, on a meeting at the NDCAP meeting on the 26th of September. And he was there, I assume, to serve as an expert on tritium in general. And he made an awful lot of statements about the safety of exposure to tritium. Well, it seemed to me, and I looked this up, his PhD from Caltech in 1985 was a PhD in geochemistry. And it seemed to me, although I wish I had had the opportunity to actually sit down and talk with him on a one-on-one basis over coffee, as was suggested, but I didn't. It seemed to me that he really, although he had some knowledge about environmental sciences, he had virtually no valid information that was up to date about any of the health risks that people get exposed to for ingestion, inhalation, or absorption of radioactive materials, and what happens once it gets inside the bodies. So those are my concerns. And I felt that the necessity to have this presentation in a public forum today was really in order to provide the other side of the story and to have people present, experts in the field, who have a lot of knowledge in these fields, present what they could to actually provide the public with balanced information, since we're all involved in this process. And the people that live and visit here are going to be the ones that are going to suffer the consequences of whatever decisions are being made by Holtec in the future. So I don't know if you'd like to respond to that, but please do if you wish.
I agree, and Holtec agrees. We think the dialogue is important. We are committed to being transparent in this process. The reference that Mrs. Turco made to us providing 2015 data, we provided 2015 data because that was the last discharge that we had made from the plant. And we presented it as 2015 data. It wasn't as any attempt to provide sleight of hand. It was the most recent information that we had regarding the constituents of a radiological discharge from the station. And that's why we use that. So I'm sure that Dr. Conca would welcome the opportunity to be able to talk through some of the results that he presented, because he not only relied on his own expertise, but also expertise epidemiologists and medical professionals in the development of that presentation. It wasn't strictly his own presentation, so I'm sure he would be happy to provide a dialogue or be available to open dialogue. Unfortunately, at that NDCAP meeting, it turned into a shouting match instead of the ability to be able to discuss and debate the issues in an open forum. So I'm sure he would welcome the opportunity to be able to do that with technical folks and be able to have that discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. So I just have one other question for you. And then I'll see if anyone else, I don't know if we have to stop exactly at 6. We may have a little extra time. So I think a lot of people are aware that there has been over a long period of time the idea that you can dump fairly hazardous materials in fairly significant quantities into our oceans, bays, and rivers, and that happened. I don't think anybody can debate that that didn't happen. There are basically dead areas in our oceans that have been, I've seen them based on underwater videos, where there is no longer marine life present. And who knows what was in those canisters that were dumped, but I think we've gotten beyond that. I certainly hope we have. And I hope that we're now at the point where everybody recognizes that this is not just an easy way to get rid of something cheaply that's potentially quite hazardous. It's just wrong. And also, I mentioned at the beginning, I feel very strongly that there is a sense, there has to be a social and corporate responsibility to protect our environment, to protect the health of the people that could be adversely affected. And I would hope that Holtec today would say that, yes, we agree there is a responsibility to ensure that we pay attention to those things.
We absolutely agree that there is a responsibility to pay attention to those things, to approach it from a scientific aspect and make sure that we are thoroughly evaluating the potential impact of our decisions and what the outcomes would be. We fully agree.
As you know, your decisions are also being evaluated by a lot of other people that may disagree.
Dr. Potvin, could I add?
Yes, go
one?
ahead, Arnie.
Just two items. I know I said that Holtec has never been licensed to operate a nuclear power plant, and their expertise is in destroying the buildings. When you destroy the buildings, you bring in a staff of rental techs to monitor the radiation, and I know that that's what's happening at Pilgrim. There's a transient group of professionals that are hired for a year or two or three to work specific jobs. The last thing I'd like to say is to suggest that Dr. Conca is somehow more objective than the panel here today. If you go up on Dr. Conca's website, he received a $980,000 grant from the Department of Energy to promote nuclear power. And the day that Fukushima was melting down, Dr. Conca was making a presentation at the legislature in Washington State. And he assured the legislature that Fukushima was entirely under control and that working in a nuclear power plant, his words, were safer than working at Toys R Us. So to present Dr. Conca as somehow unbiased compared to the group here, I think is really not objective. And I can provide those links, Barry. I'll send you the links on Conca and on his webpage, and you can do with them as you see.
Mr. Gunderson, how about David Lochbaum? Is he objective?
I'm not sure it's productive to get in a back and forth.
Well, I just want, if you want objectivity, David Lochbaum, who was an anti-nuclear activist for decades, went in front of the Indian Point panel and identified that he thought that the discharge of water from Indian Point was the most environmentally responsible way to disposition the water.
So,
Dr. Lundberg, do you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. I just had a quick comment to follow up on the Holtec representative's comment about background radiation. He mentioned that the releases would be only twice background radiation. But background radiation is not harmless. To my understanding, Beer 7 noted that background radiation is responsible across the United States for 10 million deaths a year. So, or 10, and I can grab that data to make sure that that is correct. Might not be 10 million. I will find that. But my point is, background radiation is not harmless.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to indicate that I thought that it was harmless, but it certainly is our standard, right? We're not, there isn't anything that we can do other than limiting our own exposure to that potential for the natural radiation. There isn't anything that we're going to do to attenuate or abate that.
I know there are some other folks in the room who have some questions.
We need to end this exchange.
Yeah, if I could just...
It's a lot of back and forth, and we need to allow some of the other people to have something to say if they wish to.
If I could just real quick, I want to respond to one thing that Mr. Noyes said. He said that that Holtec would be making their decisions based on science, but I want to contend that this is not simply a scientific decision. There are economic considerations that must be had here in town. There are emotional considerations that have to be here in town, sir. There are people who live here, who work here, and who raise families here. So this simply can't be a scientific decision. The science is certainly going to inform it, and I think that the science speaks to the side of everyone else who are emotionally and economically invested in this as well. So I know Terry wants to introduce other folks.
Yeah, Mary, did you want to make one other comment?
Terry, please speak, and then Cindy.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Terry.
Yes, Mary Lampert, I'm sort of playing good cop, bad cop with Dave. He was talking about the release, how much tritium would be released if in fact that is what they intend to do. However, released into Cape Cod Bay, that has been a receptacle for many releases, including the large airborne releases during the operations of that reactor. So you're just not getting X number that will show up when they apply March 31st, I believe, for the modification for the discharge permits. You have to look at what is in the bay now, so you'll have far more tritium that has so many years of a half-life, plus you will have other radionuclides, plus you will have metals, plus you have chemicals, and interestingly, it's the University of Plymouth in the UK that is, excuse me, has done extensive research of the interplay of chemicals, metals, with radionuclides, each enhancing, I don't know what happened to my voice, each other's mischief. So you have to look at the whole thing. And Cape Cod Bay has been deteriorating from various insults over the years, and it's not improving, so it is not the time to add more damage.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Dr. Reed, you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to give everyone else a chance. Any other questions?
I think Cindy
Comments?
Focus had a hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to say one thing. Thank you for inviting me today. As an overarching issue, communities that have hosted nuclear facilities have potential legacy exposures. So you're not just talking about the continual contamination of the environment. You're talking about a continual contamination or damage of human bodies across generations. And the effects could start out subtle and small, but over a number of decades, they can grow into something that isn't so subtle anymore. Increases in cancers, increases in infertility or inability to get or maintain a healthy pregnancy. And so whenever a proposal like this is put on the table, it's never just encased in its own issue. It is the entire issue over decades that a community should really be considering here. So as a consideration for this community or uranium mining communities or any other community that has had to deal with legacy exposures, I would please ask that it be taken as a whole generational picture, not just this one dumping this one time, because there are cumulative impacts of this kind of behavior and release, and they really need to be accounted for. And we are not so good at doing that, frankly.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you for joining us today. Towards the end, I just wanted to bring up a couple of other things that I found in this purpose of, during research of this. I was asked to actually make this available for a screen share also. So this was actually provided by Mary Olson, and this is just a graphic representation about the number of cases per 100,000 age appears, comparing males to females with age to see how it would change. And you can see there's quite a difference there. There's a couple of other things that I wanted to share with you on this also, if I could, before we call it an evening. There is, see if I can find it here. This is a list of sources. And so if anyone wishes to look further into this information, the National Academy of Sciences report from 2006, which was called Beer 7 Phase 2. The reference to it is there. Their conclusion was that the committee concludes, and it was a huge study, that current scientific evidence is consistent with the hypothesis that there is linear, no threshold dose-response relationship between exposure to ionizing radiation and the development of cancer in humans. They also brought up at some point, I forget where I saw it, that there is some evidence that exposure to radiation, again, especially internal radiation, is positively associated, once again, with neurological issues and also with immunological issues. So we're not just talking about cancer. There's a range of potential damage to human health involved here. There's something here about the Gender and Radiation Impact Project. There is down here some information about exploring tritium dangers. And there's actually Dr. Akajani published a book about that, which is available for purchase. And although I did find the podcast reference for Dr. Ian Fairley, even better, I found a YouTube video of a presentation which is much shorter and much easier to listen to than the lengthy, I think 90-minute or so podcast that he did at some point. So there is a YouTube video that he also did that you could also look at. So those of you who might want to look into this further certainly can. The only other thing I wanted to mention, and I don't know if I can even find it any longer, is this. Oh, that's the wrong one. Well, I may have lost the one I wanted to share, but there was a report that came out just in February of this year of 6 Holtec workers having been exposed to radiation while they were working at the Pilgrim plant. And it actually happened back in, I think, 2019 or maybe 2020. And the report was not gotten into the NRC until almost 2 years later. And then it took another 2 months before that report made its way out to the public. So when you think about what is going on, is the NRC sitting on this information? Was Holtec sitting on this information? Why did it take so long to make its way to the authority of the NRC people before it actually got anywhere else? I'd love to know the answer to that question as well. If anyone else has any final comments or questions, we're a little bit over what I had hoped. I always prided myself on keeping these meetings to 2 hours or less. We couldn't do it, but we tried. But if anyone has any closing statements to make, please feel free to raise your hand so we can recognize you to do so. I see none. Margaret, is there anything I'm missing?
Nope, I think we got everybody.
Okay, in that case, I would ask the Board of Health members who are present. One person needs to make a motion to adjourn the informational public forum that we just had.
I so move.
And is there a second to the motion?
Second.
And we should poll the members of the board. So Dr. Reed?
Yes.
Amy?
Yes.
David?
Yes.
Lorenzo?
Lorenzo had to leave the meeting.
You had to leave? And myself, because I'm still here, barely, but I'm still here. Yes, so it's unanimous. This initial informational Board of Health public forum is now adjourned. We will hope to schedule another one on a different topic, maybe once every 2 months or so, whichever the Board of Health feels is appropriate.